Luffy versus Kizaru is genuinely the most misunderstood fight in all of One Piece, really no matter what side you take or what agenda you may have. There's things that people assume or just outright ignore about this confrontation, so I'm going to go over the major parts of this fight, at least that I think are relevant. And so of course this is going to have a bias because this is literally my interpretation. But I do believe it is the most consistent interpretation of this fight and the scaling of these characters. Starting off with the first panel, probably one of the most controversial aspects of this fight itself, at least visually, is the Haki that Luffy is using during the fight. Oda is frustratingly bad at depicting Conqueror's coding, but based on the information that we do have, typically the best way to tell if a character is using Conqueror's coding without it being verbatim stated is if the black lightning shown is thicker or more sporadic or wavy than typically shown. If it is shown either before or after the attack actually lands, if it follows a path rather than being just a normal lightning bolt, and also specifically having a zit sound effect. This is shown with multiple different characters like Luffy, Kaido, Yamato, Garp, and Zoro, and while it is a roundabout and flimsy way to determine if a power is being used, it is also the most consistent and also hard to ignore when you look at the evidence provided. Nearly every instance of Conqueror's coding that has ever been definitively confirmed uses the zit sound effect, and at least throughout the entirety of Wano going into Egghead and even Elbaf, this sound effect is never used for natural lightning. It is only ever used for Conqueror's coding, and so I simply can't in good faith act as if this is not intentional, at least to some extent. That being said, the only thing that we see in this panel for Luffy is moderately sized black lightning, so I simply see no reason to assume that this is Conqueror's coding rather than just normal armament Haki. However, beyond that, I also want to address the fact that people seem to ignore that Luffy is just blatantly damaged going into this fight. I know people like to make the argument that because he ate food prior that he's completely fine, due to statements like him saying that now that he's full, he's at full power. But this is after Luffy just finished stuffing his face with a mountain of food. He eats in quite a bit after the fight with Rob Lucci and the Seraphim, but not nearly to that extent. What's also shown is that all of Luffy's prior injuries are completely gone. He now looks completely unscathed. Literally the first panel where Luffy and Kizaru start fighting, Luffy is still clearly shown to be damaged. That's not something that you just mistakenly do. Oda clearly meant to depict the fact that Luffy is still damaged, when he didn't do that when Luffy was actually at full power, because he was completely recovered. Even when we cut back to the Straw Hats after the fight, Chopper is still healing Robin, which implies that the fight is only recently finished, not that it's been finished for over an hour or something like that. And the general vibe of this panel is that things have only now just wrapped up, as in, again, recently. And given the fact that they were also continuously running around, I don't think there was really any time for Luffy to completely recover. But again, just completely disregarding what I said and what I think about what happened previously before this, there is literally no reason for Oda to depict Luffy being damaged here if he's not damaged. I don't think there's a single valid argument you could make against this point, because he simply doesn't have to draw Luffy like this if he's not damaged or wants to depict them both being at 100%. Now, I want to move on to the statement made in this panel, but also another few statements that are made, and just the general scaling of a few characters, because I feel like when people see these statements, they assume only one interpretation, while not even thinking about the fact that another one can be made. And I'm not saying that it's like out of malice or that people are just being disingenuous even. I'm saying that I genuinely think people don't think about this interpretation, and it's that in regards to the statement of Luffy getting 100 times stronger, that this can simply refer to base Luffy. Majority of people, if not all people, immediately assume this refers to Luffy's peak, aka Gear 5 Luffy, but nothing insinuates that. If anything, contextually that wouldn't even make sense. This whole panel is essentially like Luffy, quote unquote, getting back at Kizaru, showing Kizaru that things are going to be different. Kizaru actually has to defend against these characters now. They're actually threatening to him, and Luffy shows that with this attack, proceeding to say that we are now 100 times stronger. It wouldn't really make sense for Luffy to be demonstrating a lower level of strength to what he's actually stating here. Again, I personally like to scale this series with the most consistency possible, and I think this interpretation is also more consistent. Gear 5 Luffy, even if you think he's not above Kaido, I don't know why you would think that, he clearly is, but he's at the very least extremely relative to Kaido, and given that all Yonkos are relative, even if you think that Blackbeard is like the strongest in the verse for some reason, Kaido should be extremely relative to him, and Rayleigh willingly admits that he would not be able to beat Blackbeard as he is currently. He doesn't even attempt to do so, and you could make a roundabout argument of how close of a fight it would be, but it's worth mentioning if Rayleigh were to fight here, then Boa Hancock wouldn't be getting defeated here. So if a fight were to break out here, it's likely that he would have the assistance of Boa Hancock and all of the Kuja warriors times as well, and he still doesn't think that he even stands a chance against Blackbeard. This just wouldn't make sense if he scaled to Gear 5 Luffy. What makes more sense to me is that he scales to base Luffy, and I feel like the only people who would have a problem with Rayleigh scaling to base Luffy is people who downplay base Luffy. Base Luffy is capable of splitting the sky, a feat that only Yonkos have performed, is just blatantly above hybrid Yamato who could fight on par with Kaido for a bit, and by no means is a fodder character. But to add on to that, you have scaling even in Elbaf where base Luffy is fighting Gabon. Gabon uses what is likely a Conqueror's coding attack on him given the depiction of lightning and the sound effect, and it literally does nothing to Luffy. Like, nothing in the slightest. He completely no-sells this attack. Gabon, who is stated to be on par or standing shoulder to shoulder and or equal to Rayleigh several times. So old Rayleigh and old Gabon should be extremely relative if not equal, and base Luffy is clearly comparable to old Gabon, and that's when he was holding back and not even trying to fight, which provides more consistency to this scaling chain. Why this matters in reference to Kizaru is because Kizaru was stated to be incapable of getting past old Rayleigh, and old Rayleigh who was arguably even holding back. But even with that not being the case, it's just blatantly stated that he cannot get past old Rayleigh. So again, base Luffy would be equal to Kizaru, old Gabon, and old Rayleigh. And all of this is once again very consistent. Now to talk about another thing that I feel like people kind of misrepresent or don't think about, and also provide even more consistency, is Kaido's perception within the universe. For example, when Kizaru says that, oh, you're definitely the guy who defeated Kaido, we know that he has a drunken hybrid form which is stronger than even his normal hybrid form, and we know that he has a hybrid form. But why exactly would Kizaru know that? Kizaru has never had a fight with Kaido, and if you're gonna claim that, oh, that's a baseless claim, you don't know that, it is for the best that we take the interpretation that Kaido has never fought an admiral. Because if he has fought an admiral, then we have to question his statement that he hasn't had a good fight in years, or like in a very long time. And this is in comparison to base Luffy. So if you think that Kaido has fought an admiral and that any admiral knows how strong Kaido is, then it kind of just ends up in the same way. None of them should be close to base Luffy. But I like to think more logically and assume that none of them have fought Kaido or know how strong Kaido truly is. So their only frame of reference for Kaido is base Kaido, in being very generous, maybe normal hybrid Kaido. But I'm not just saying this in regards to Kizaru's statement, but also Green Bull's statement. He wouldn't have come to Wano if Kaido was still there, and Green Bull's perception of Kaido would at best be hybrid Kaido, the Kaido that base Luffy was able to fight on par with. Green Bull's statement implies that he does not want to fight Kaido, and that he doesn't believe that he would win against Kaido, the character who was fighting extremely relative to base Luffy, meaning that Green Bull would be below base Luffy, at best extremely relative to him. Green Bull who should be extremely relative to Kizaru considering that they're both admirals, and the position of admiral is a position of strength. You can say that Kizaru is stronger because he's been an admiral for longer, and I would even agree, but at the very least they are still extremely relative. So to recap everything I've said so far in this sort of scaling chain, Kizaru and Rayleigh are equal. This statement would imply that base Luffy and Rayleigh are equal. Base Luffy should be extremely relative to Gabon if not above him, and Green Bull, who should be extremely relative to Kizaru, is below somebody extremely relative to base Luffy. All of the characters mentioned should be in the same tier of strength or at the same level, and all of these things combining together make this very, very consistent. And to bring up another statement that would also make this very consistent is from Luffy's Vivre Card, where again, like I said, it's another statement I feel like people think there's only one interpretation for, when it says that Luffy rematched with Kizaru and was more than evenly matched, implying that Luffy was not just equal to Kizaru but above him. People would assume that this refers to Gear 5 Luffy, but again, that does not have to be the case. This could refer to base Luffy and it would still make complete sense and nothing would be contradicted. And given the fact that I've just gone over what I would at least say is a very solid, consistent scaling chain for these characters, I think this referring to base Luffy simply makes the most consistent sense. I think that base Luffy was more than evenly matched with Kizaru, which would make him a bit above Kizaru, which would also make sense because he should be a bit above Gabon as well, and he should also be a bit above Green Bull because Green Bull should be below Kaido. And so my personal interpretation is that base Luffy is more than evenly matched with Kizaru, which would put him a bit above Kizaru, but at the same time there's a very solid argument for him being a tiny bit above Gabon. But again, he was for the most part holding back against Gabon and still able to fight relative to him and no-sell his attacks, which makes me believe that he's a bit above Gabon as well. And also Green Bull at least implies inferiority to Kaido. His perception of Kaido, which at best best is Hybrid Kaido, who is extremely relative to base Luffy. So base Luffy should also be a bit above Green Bull. So again, there's consistency for all of this. The only one that you can't make a direct correlation to is Rayleigh. But even then, given that he's not using Conqueror's coding here as I went over earlier, and he's referring to himself within this moment, it's even possible then that base Luffy when using Conqueror's coding is a bit above Rayleigh. That's one interpretation, but even a slight alteration of that interpretation is that he's more than evenly matched in the sense that he starts off even and then eventually gets stronger over time as he gets into his higher gears, which would also make sense as he would just be much stronger than Kizaru in Gear 5 while still being equal to Kizaru in his base form. I think either of those interpretations is fine and simply the most consistent interpretation. And this is again just me taking multiple bits of information, putting them together and finding the consistency between them. I don't think there is a reason for me not to believe that these characters are all at the same level, again apart from Gear 5 Luffy, who should be above all of them pretty significantly. But to continue with the actual fight between Kizaru and Luffy, I'm sure what people will say is that in the actual fight Luffy goes into Snake Man off screen, and people will take this as Luffy needing Snake Man. I simply don't agree. We've seen Luffy jump up in gears randomly or just for fun. He could literally no-sell an attack from Gabon and just immediately skips all of his gears and goes into Gear 5. I don't think him using Snake Man is indicative of him needing to get stronger. If anything, at best I think it means he needed to get faster, which is fine. Luffy can be above Kizaru and still be slower than Kizaru, the same way Akainu is slower than Kizaru given that Kizaru is stated to be the fastest admiral, and yet Akainu is still above Kizaru. So at best I think Luffy just needs more speed here, especially when if he needed more power he would just use Conqueror's coding because he still hasn't used that yet. And people love to talk about Kizaru's mindset and his quote-unquote mental nerf, which I'll get into later, but glaze over the fact that Luffy's mindset here in this fight, especially during the beginning, is of him still questioning why Kizaru is even after Vegapunk. Luffy as a character is the type to fight harder if he truly has something to fight for, if he can gain conviction in his actions and what he is doing. Kaido was literally enslaving people and hurting people close to him that he cared about. Kizaru is a man that he still doesn't even understand the motives of. So I think even mentally Luffy is not completely in this fight. The next thing that I see a lot of people try to argue for is that Kizaru blitzed and one-shot Snake Man Luffy, which is just wrong for multiple reasons. So there's two interpretations of Luffy getting blitzed here, because we clearly see that his hand is in like a formation of blocking the sunlight before he then turns it into what would be like a blocking position, or at least you could interpret it that way. He could also just still be blocking his eyes but more directly because Kizaru is closer. But that really only leaves two interpretations. Either he's moving his hand to block and therefore he literally is reacting and blocked the attack, or Kizaru literally blinded him and so he's not capable of reacting like he normally would anyways. So this wouldn't be an actual blitz regardless of the interpretation. And then Kizaru just doesn't knock him out of Snake Man. I don't know where people got that from. When Kizaru kicks him away, there's no smoke trailing after him, like there usually would be if he was knocked out of Gear 4. The smoke trail only begins when he goes through the robot. Now what caused this to happen, whether it was the literal explosion here or just him leaving Snake Man himself, really doesn't matter. The point is that Kizaru's kick alone is not what made him exit Snake Man. So yeah, the whole narrative that Kizaru blitzed and one-shot him is just pretty misrepresented and misconstrued entirely. We then get the statement of pretty much Luffy implying that Kizaru's attack didn't do anything and that it was the barrier that damaged him, which mind you would be lasting throughout the rest of the fight. Environmental damage was done to Luffy that Kizaru cannot replicate. Now I know people are gonna claim that, oh, it's light that did this to Luffy. Kizaru is light, he can replicate it. This is light that Vegapunk worked on. There's no reason to believe that Kizaru can replicate it because we don't know if Vegapunk made it stronger or more potent. It also wouldn't make sense considering that later we see that Luffy was completely unaffected by one of Kizaru's light beams. Literally all that Kizaru can get out of him is a very like small oomph, or whatever the sound that Luffy makes is. It wasn't even remotely close to the amount of damage that Luffy sustained here. You can argue that Kizaru can make his beams more potent, but you can't prove that he could make them that potent, which is the point. Nothing actually suggested Kizaru can replicate this. People also point out that Bonnie hit the barrier and survived, so clearly it's not that potent, but Bonnie only hit the barrier. She didn't actually go through it like Luffy did, and Luffy went through it twice. We then have Luffy grabbing Kizaru, again showing that Luffy is just toying with him, as later on he squeezes Kizaru making him bleed, versus just not doing that originally, and just holding Kizaru normally. Again, it's clear that Luffy isn't taking this seriously. He doesn't have any real motive to hurt Kizaru. He's just toying with him. He could very easily just squeeze squeeze him harder here, or even do more than that, but at no point is Luffy actually going all out. It's also worth mentioning for reference, when Luffy grabs Kaido, one would argue far more aggressively, and we even get a crunch sound effect, the grab itself does literally nothing to Kaido. He doesn't even react to just being grabbed. I mean, obviously he reacts to being grabbed, but he doesn't react to any pain or anything. But again, that's just me pointing something out. Even when fighting Kizaru's clones, Luffy is able to dodge pretty much every attack. Only one even narrowly lands on him, but again, mind you, the attacks that he's using here are still all just basic armament. He doesn't once use Conqueror's Coding despite being this far into the fight, when one would think that if he used Conqueror's Coding already earlier that he would just continue using it, especially if Kizaru's defenses were strong enough to block it. I know people will bring this up as well when it comes to Kizaru's lasers actually affecting Luffy. This is because Luffy literally ate it. It's hurting him internally, which would essentially just be Luffy forcing durability negation on himself. Again, when Kizaru actually just normally hits Luffy with a light beam, it does absolutely nothing. Kizaru, likely realizing that he can't do anything against Luffy, begins to try to wear him out, knowing that he has a time limit. Despite that, Luffy still is able to keep up with him even in terms of travel speed, not just combat speed, and finally attacks him with White Star Gun, where he blitzes Kizaru and at least temporarily puts him out of commission, one-shotting him. People will argue that Kizaru's beam amped his speed, but the fact that Luffy landed the attack means that he could also control the speed, so it's not like he's going any faster than he can handle, so it's hard to imagine that this made any real difference. And I know a lot of people assume White Star Gun to be Conqueror's Coding, but again, there is no real indication of this being the case. The depiction of Black Lightning isn't even close to what is actually shown for attacks that have Conqueror's Coding, and there is also no zit sound effect that would indicate that. Even with the attack that one could argue that this is based off of, which does utilize Conqueror's Coding, it actually has this sound effect, and is also shown with lightning effects before and after the attack, which the attack on Kizaru isn't. So even in that aspect, it's not depicted in the same way, even if we ignore that there's no trailing effect or any super sporadic lightning bolts. But again, this just makes sense. Luffy never during this fight used any Conqueror's Coding. And again, it simply wouldn't make any sense for him to go from using Conqueror's Coding to not using Conqueror's Coding, and then back to using Conqueror's Coding when he couldn't even land a hit anyways. Why would he use a stronger attack rather than a faster attack? Using a stronger attack isn't going to make your attack land. You would want to get faster. So changing what Haki he's using here wouldn't really make any sense. Now, to address probably what is the most important factor of this video, it is Kizaru being quote-unquote mentally nerfed. This argument in general and how it's used is completely disingenuous and essentially tries to redefine the concept that's actually being described, which is, simply put, that when you hesitate or waver, you are weak. This just describes basic hesitation. If you're throwing a punch and you hesitate, you are no longer putting your all into that punch. That punch is therefore weakened. But in that example, your punch, the actual action, is being hesitant. The action of punching is what you were hesitating on. When Kizaru kicks Luffy, he has no reason to hesitate. He's not going to hesitate over kicking Luffy. He has no connection to Luffy. Sure, we see him hesitate in wanting to hurt Bonnie because he has a connection to Bonnie, and we even get a speech bubble of it just saying tap, as in him tapping Bonnie away. But Kizaru has no attachment to Luffy. His actions towards Luffy wouldn't be hesitant or any weaker. He's not going to be any slower or any less durable. And this is probably the biggest misconception and honestly S-tier gaslighting from the community, because a mental nerf is just a fan-made term for characters hesitating in their actions. And people ran with that, making it something and treating it something like it's not. Like it's a status effect in Pokemon, to where, oh, now you have the status effect of poison applied to you and all of your stats are decreased. But that's just not what that means in the slightest, and nothing entails that to be the case. It is as simple as one hesitates, and that action that you were hesitating on becomes weaker, and therefore, yes, you can argue becomes slower. The idea of this applying to durability is like just completely nonsensical. The only reason that this has ever applied to durability in the case of someone like Garp and Marineford against Luffy is because he is in a completely vulnerable state. He is not defending in the slightest. Even Axe-Hand Morgan can damage Garp when he's not prepared for it. So if we're arguing that Kizaru was that nerfed to that extent of Garp, if he was so weakened that someone like Axe Hand Morgan could damage him, he would no longer have his head. He would not be with us anymore. I don't want to stick to this too long because I think it's pointless, but I just have no idea how this mental nerf argument became so big, because it is literally just redefining something that is so very simple. That being said, I don't really think that anything after this is really that important. Luffy pretty much just slaps Kizaru around every now and then and flattens him in Saturn. I think it's by this point that eventually you just have to look at narrative portrayal. Oda is literally having Luffy fight a Gorosei and a Admiral at the same time. There's the feat that when Kizaru tries to go after Sanji and Vegapunk again, Luffy just outright blitzes him while he's in motion. And there's also the fact that after this, when Kizaru tries to attack him, Luffy dodges. I bring this up because in a similar situation where Luffy was holding Kaido, he couldn't dodge his blast breath, but he dodged these light beams from Kizaru, which is again just something worth pointing out, a similarity in the situation. But I mean, yeah, beyond that, I don't think there's too much to talk about. Luffy is clearly portrayed as being above him. At least, again, if you for some reason think that Kizaru is quote unquote mentally nerfed, then sure, above this mentally nerfed Kizaru. So again, I think that base Luffy being equal to or greater than Kizaru is perfectly fine. I honestly see no reason not to think that, and I think that it's incredibly consistent with the amount of arguments you can make, again, surrounding Rayleigh being relative to Kizaru, and also Gabon being relative to Luffy, etc, etc. I've already gone over it. I'm not going to restate everything again, but point is, again, I think that entire chain of scaling is very, very consistent. And while I think that overall Luffy just completely dominated this fight against Kizaru, really the only thing noteworthy that Kizaru actually did was give him a cut on the cheek. Beyond that, there's really nothing positive to say for Kizaru in the fight. And while I do think you can definitely argue that oh, neither of them were giving this fight their all, that's completely fine. The difference is I know Luffy is holding back. I know he's not using Conqueror's coding, and I know that he can do better than this. I haven't seen Kizaru do anything more than this, so this is my highest frame of reference. If Kizaru eventually in the story does significantly more than this, I highly doubt he will, but if he does, then I'll change my mind. But for the time being, I do believe that base Luffy is just equal to or greater than Kizaru. And if you do disagree with anything I said, I'd love to hear why, but other than that, that is it for me.